Great. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for all getting here and making sure we have a quorum. Let's get this meeting going. It's beautiful outside. I'm sure you don't want to be in your offices. So, as Leo was telling us, we don't have to read the script in its entirety anymore. I just need to say that this meeting is being visually and what's the word?
Audio recorded.
Video and audio recorded. And then I'm going to read the 5th paragraph on public comment. For items with public comment after members have spoken, the chair will afford 3 minutes of public comment to those members of the public that have joined the meeting via Zoom. Members of the public who wish to speak must state their names and be acknowledged by and speak through the chair. Use the raise hand feature in Zoom under reactions to indicate you'd like to offer a comment. Chair will call on those who have raised their hands in the order they were raised. All questions must be directed to the chair. Done with that. So, I want to call this meeting. My name is Peter Brace. I'm calling this meeting of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee to order April 9th, 2024 at 10 a.m. We'll get right into it. Public comment. This is public comment for anything that is not on the agenda. Is there anybody in the public who wants to make a comment? Okay.
Yes, Peter, my hand is up.
Okay, Deanne Atherton, go ahead.
Thank you, Peter, and members of the committee. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. First of all, I have 3 just very brief items for public comment, and I had spoken to Peter earlier about this. I was going to try and get an email to him and to Leah as a heads up, but I will follow up with an email so that you have it for the record. 3 quick things. One is, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy, we have become familiar in the past months with a new type of imaging, which is quite spectacular, and it's called photogrammetry. Maybe some of you have worked with it. I believe the Natural Resources Department may have. We're fortunate on Nantucket in that we have a practitioner, Jacob Tinkhauser, who is the head of Far-Fetched Nantucket. It's an amazing tool for monitoring and measuring erosion. And I just think it might be beneficial to everyone to put this on the agenda, a future agenda, and invite Jacob to explain exactly what it is and its application to coastal resilience. My second item, and I'm sorry Christy isn't here, but in reviewing the warrant for upcoming town meeting, we noticed that there's a $10 million capital appropriation for relocating the sewer to Sankaty to provide sewer service for, I believe it's the properties 104 to 120 Baxter Road, which are the properties on the west side of Baxter Road, north of Bayberry. If so, the town is to be commended for moving forward with this important component of the relocation plan. And Christy is the representative from the Capital Program Committee to CRAC, and maybe he can provide more information about, and we can all learn, sort of what are the funding sources and what are the funding steps. Then my third comment is that there is presently a notice of intent before the Conservation Commission to replace and repair the choir installations on the public beach below the bluff in Sconset. And it's for properties from 59 to 83 Baxter Road. In order for this notice of intent to go forward, the major property owner in the area, that is the town, has to sign off on the application. And this just seems to us a marvelous opportunity for the town, has some leverage in this regard, And perhaps the town could swing into action and secure hold harmless agreements from these property owners, as well as one big beach easements. While it's happening in Sconset, it could very well happen in other parts of the island. And if the town was prepared with a protocol that they just kind of implemented immediately, it could be very beneficial in securing especially the hold harmless agreements, which are part of the Coastal Resilience Plan. That's it, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Deanne. Is there any other public comment?
Peter, it's Matt Fee. I know we don't get into detail about this. The town is aware of the importance of those issues that Dan has brought up. I think we have to proceed carefully, because if the town jumps into action and does a bunch of things that is opposite what Concom comes out of their hearings with, then, we aren't supporting Concom. So I think, I think those issues will be negotiated, discussed, et cetera, my guess is once they've come out of Concom. And Concom can require public access, et cetera. It's part of their purview. So then we may, we will look at it after that, as opposed to, the applicants going to whichever parent will give them what they want, So I think we learned our lesson the last go around. Hopefully we do a little better this one. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Any other members want to comment on anything that Deanne said? Okay, Doug.
Sorry, didn't get my little electronic hand up in time. My understanding is, Matt, that the NOI can't proceed to Concom officially until the town signs off on it. And so I think the whole point here is the town has leverage until the moment it signs off. And so I think that would be the only hitch in the logic there. Thanks.
Okay. Is there any other public comment? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to approval of the minutes.
Peter, we don't have any minutes.
Okay, no minutes. All right, then we're going on to presentation and discussion on the Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model by Kirk Bosma, Senior Coastal Engineer and Innovation Director at the Woods Hole Group. Go ahead, Kirk. And thank you for coming.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Chairman. Appreciate you guys' time. I'm back here again. I talked to you guys a few months ago about dynamic adaptation planning pathways, if you remember, about how to kind of navigate some of these uncertainties with climate change and sea level rise. And I'm happy to talk to you today a little bit more about some of the foundational work that goes into that and other things across the state related to sea level rise and climate change. And I know that's been a little bit of a discussion as you guys are working on your bylaws and regulations. So I thought, and Leah thought, it was a good time to just give you a little bit of a download or update on an overview of the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. So I'm going to share my screen here a second. Hopefully this works fairly seamlessly. Can you guys see my screen? Because I can't see you anymore, unfortunately. Somebody give me a verbal cue.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So let me give you guys an overview of the Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model, or MCFRM. A little bit about where, its roots, the genesis of where it came from, what it provides, how it can be used, and then clarify, I think, some misunderstandings about what it really is and how it relates to some of the other stuff that's out there. So the model started in earnest after Hurricane Sandy came up the Atlantic seaboard and kind of really impacted the New Jersey and New York coastline, but was viewed as kind of a near miss for Massachusetts. And there was a lot of questions based on, the upper picture there is flooding that happened in New York City. And, obviously one of the big things we have in the Commonwealth is the Central Artery Tunnel System, affectionately known as the Big Dig back then. And what would happen to that system if it was flooded? And it really wasn't a question of, what would happen when it flooded, but what really was the probability that that was going to be an issue, right? You can have these big hurricanes that come up and would cause major issues like Sandy, but what's the real probability that we get that? And then if something like that did occur, what really is vulnerable? This is a massive system throughout Boston. What's vulnerable? What would really be the priority of building resilience? It's an amazing system engineering wise, but it might not be the most redundant in terms of how it works. They have these massive fans under the ground pumping air through the system. If one of those gets hit or gets affected, they have to shut the whole tunnel down. So it's not just water getting into the tunnel. It's if any egress or vent building or anything gets hit, they have to shut the tunnel down. So they needed to know how to prioritize that. They weren't going to redo the whole system, obviously, which is billions of dollars, but how do they make it more resilient in a smart way? And so then what was the plan? How do you do that? And those three questions, there were a lot of the same three questions we're hearing kind of across the Commonwealth, across the US from various communities. Okay, we see these maps of sea level rise and climate change and flooding showing water all over the place, but you can't really design for that, right? It's not cost effective. It's cost prohibitive, in fact. And so how do we smartly plan for these conditions? How do we move forward and look forward in a smart way, as opposed to, assuming that everything is going to be underwater, because that's not really how it's going to work. And so that we looked at kind of existing information that was out there. And this is some of the reason why the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model was developed. So there's FEMA, which you might be familiar with. Those are, the flood insurance rate maps. That's on the left-hand side. That's really a backwards looking tool. It doesn't look forward into the future. It doesn't have climate change effects. Just looks at one storm only, this quote unquote 100-year storm, which is a little bit hard to wrap your head around, because just because you have a 100-year storm in terms of water levels and waves doesn't mean you're going to see that same type of flooding everywhere. 100-year storm at, downtown Nantucket might be different than it is obviously on the south side of Nantucket. And different storms would cause that. So Region 1, which is the Northeast, also doesn't use any kind of dynamic modeling. It's all, kind of based on these transects. So you can see that big 5 that runs through that area. Everything mapped on that map is based on what happens along that single line. So it's not overly accurate, which is why you can do letters of map revision with FEMA very easily, because if you are at an area what's not along that transect, you could put a new transect in, use things like photogrammetry to get elevations or surveys to get elevations, and basically remap it based on what the waves and water levels do on that site-specific location. It also is a little bit, odd if you look at this map, for example, and you look at this line right here, you have a base flood elevation of 12 feet here. And then right next to it, you have a base flood elevation of 14 feet. I haven't been anywhere in any place where I've seen the water level jump just 2 feet on a line like this. So it really isn't physically based in any level. And at the end of the day, it's for a different purpose, right? It's for flood insurance. It's not for design or planning per se, although it's for the longest time, it's been the only tool that people have had available to think about. There's also on the right these national storm surge hazard maps. What these are basically massive hurricanes that might hit an area, and this is showing Boston and how that would work. We've never seen anything like this in Massachusetts, in Boston, of this nature, where you have this extreme of flooding, greater than 9 feet of water everywhere throughout Boston. This is worst case scenario stuff. It's for emergency planning. It's a very coarse domain, 1 or 2 points to map all of Boston. Errors are relatively large, plus or minus 20%. It just focuses on hurricanes, not nor'easters and things that we see here a little bit more commonly. And again, it's just a present conditions only thing. It's not looking to the future. That's really for saving human life, right? It's for evacuation routes. It's those type of things. What if we get the worst possible scenario that occurs? Not great for infrastructure planning or designing something, because you don't know what the probability of that really is. We've never seen this before. So Would you want to design something for something you've never seen? Yeah, probably not, right? So that's another map that's out there. Then if you go online, there's tons of these viewers, right? And this is NOAA's sea level rise viewer. And just to clarify, this isn't a model. This is just water that fills up in a bathtub. So you can go online and you can go over to this little slider here and you can say, well, what if I had 5 feet of sea level rise? Or what if I had a storm surge of 3 feet and 2 feet of sea level rise? What would that look like? And it shows where the water may or may not be throughout the area. And it's really just like filling a bathtub, right? Which is fine if you had a nice sunny day condition and you had 5 feet of sea level rise. This might be something like what you would see. But I'm sure living on Nantucket, you have been to the coast when there's a storm happening, and it's not a flat water surface elevation, right? It's not just a flat thing that fills up and flows over land. It's got waves and winds and movement of water that is fast and furious at times. It's kind of like if I fill up my bathtub at home, great, that's what this is. Like it's a calm day, I fill it up, it's flat water surface elevation. Then I put, my 4-year-old son, Hurricane Jackson, in the tub, and water is splashing all over the place. It's coming out at me, it's going all over the place. That's what, a storm surge and a coastal storm will do. So these maps are reasonable first order assessments of what might happen under a sunny day condition. If anybody could do this, you guys could all make this map, because it's just if the elevation is below the elevation of the water, that's what floods. But that's not really how water lives, breathes, moves throughout an area. It's just a flat water surface elevation. So those are the types of things that are out there available, or were out there and available. And so that's why we were committed to developing something a little bit better when we're talking about millions and billions of dollars at potential risk here. And so the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model is basically a physics-based model that looks at the movement of water during coastal storm conditions under both present day and changing climate conditions. Just to illustrate what that means, here's that same bathtub approach for Boston Harbor area. So if we'd say we had some sea level rise of 3 feet, and then we had a coastal storm come in with a surge of say 3 feet, and the water surface elevation got up to this 12-foot elevation here, right, which is in this yellow. Again, that bathtub approach, if you're using NOAA's or Climate Central's or any of these online viewers, it's just a flat water surface elevation and it fills up a basin or a bathtub. And it says, oh, if the elevation is below that, that's what floods, right? And so here you can see what would flood in Boston. And they present it as depths usually, so it gets some color variation. But in reality, it's just a flat elevation of water. If we dynamically simulate that storm that comes in with winds and waves and how things change, we get a drastically different picture of flooding throughout the area. So this is how the water actually physically moves and what happens with the surge and the waves and the tides and the winds. And so you can see down here on the south side for this storm, the peak elevation is the same. It was at 12, but because the wind and waves push water in this direction to the northeast a little bit more for this case, we actually get over 13 feet of water down in this area where you see the reds. And then up here, you get variation in the water surface elevation. It's lower in some areas, it's higher in some areas. We have dams in here that work and have pumps and that change how flooding happens behind the Charles River Dam and the Amelia Earhart Dam. And you can see the variation in flooding. If I just go back again, it's a drastically different picture of how you would plan and think about flooding under, coastal storm conditions and sea level rise conditions. And so this was enough to say, we have to do better for not only what happened to be Boston and the Central Artery Tunnel System, what turned out to be for the whole state. So this high resolution probabilistic modeling, which is MCFRM, takes into consideration sea level rise. And one thing I want to make very clear, which up front, which has been one of the bigger issues here, is MCFRM is a physics-based model of how the water moves. It does not predict sea level rise. Sea level rise is provided to the model from the state or other agencies that predict what's going to happen with sea level rise. MCFRM is not predicting what sea level rise is. It just takes that in and then simulates the movement of water on top of what's happening or projected with sea level rise. We look at both tropical and extratropical storms. That's nor'easters and hurricanes both. It has a very high resolution landscape and elevation in the model. And then it does have a changing climate so that the storm intensities and frequencies change as you evolve over time, meaning as the ocean is predicted to get warmer, those physics of the storms actually change. And what it does is it gives you a whole bunch of information beyond just where the water is, right? Am I wet or not? It gives you what's the probability that you get wet? How deep is it? What do the waves look like? What do the winds look like? All this information based on that physical movement of water. And so originally we did that just for Boston Harbor as part of this Federal Highways project for the Central Artery Tunnel System. That won a 2017 Environmental Excellence Award for the nation because it looked at how flooding was changing over time. This was a peer-reviewed method. It was reviewed by Woods Hole Oceanographic, NOAA, USGS, FEMA, and a number of other agencies to get to this level. And then it was extended from just Boston Harbor to the whole state, which then it obviously included the island of Nantucket. Some of the changes that occurred, we expanded the storm sets. We looked at dynamic wave overtopping. So when waves hit a structure, it throws water over the top. That's included in the model. It basically updated the sea level rise projections. Again, the model doesn't predict the sea level rise. We put that into the model from the state. The foundational models that it uses is this circulation model called ADCIRC, which deals with storm surges and tides and water levels. And then it's tightly coupled, or it's talking to a wave model that deals with waves and wave setup. So every sub-second, so we run this at about 1/10 of a second time scale, the physics of what the waves are doing and what the surge is doing in tides talk to each other to produce what the water levels are throughout the area. Whole bunch of input goes into this. And again, it uses all the latest topographic information, bathymetric information, meaning the elevations under the water, elevations over the land. It's a whole bunch of government-based information that goes into this. And one thing we'll focus a little bit on are these sea level rise scenarios, which I think has been kind of the big debate in terms of what's happening, which isn't a debate over the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. Again, that's just a model. It's just what sea level rise conditions are you putting into it. The model itself was calibrated and validated against tidal conditions up and down the Northeast. So you can see there, the errors are relatively small on just predicting normal tides today. We have to actually, the model simulates tides as the storms come in. So we're looking at that. But it also was calibrated against historical storms. So the blizzard of 78 was one of those storms. Hurricane Bob was another one. The perfect storm of 90 was another one. And then the 2018 storms more recently were checked again. And so to do that, we look at what the water levels during those storms that were measured in those high water marks that were shown in this figure, how those compare to what the model is actually doing. And so we go through a pretty rigorous process to make sure that the model is actually simulating how these storms move and perform and what the waves do, what the water levels do, before we even go into looking at what the risk is over the landscape for the storms. So we do that for present day conditions, but then we start to look forward in time. And what we're looking at is now we get a storm today. What happens in the future if sea level goes up and we get those storms again and the ocean temperatures changes and the storm dynamics change a little bit? How does that change what's happening in terms of your flood risk or where the water might move? Again, we're not predicting these sea level rise projections. These are provided by the state of Massachusetts as projections of what the sea level will do in the future. These are based on work done by UMass Amherst climate scientists, Rob DeCanto, and then someone at University of Rutgers, Bob Kopp, who both are high up in the IPCC world. globally for predicting sea level rise. And now these are modified specifically for the state because in the Northeast, there's some physics that happen related to potential ice sheet melting that change what the global average would be. Woods Hole Group doesn't select these. The state doesn't develop these, but these curves range from, an intermediate level here, which is this greenish color, up to an extreme level, which is this red here. And these are all provided in this DeCanto and Kopp based work. What you're looking at here is kind of the existing sea level change over time. So you can see here, it's been slowly increasing over time, but more recently it's kind of accelerated slightly. And when they originally did this projection in 2000, you can see some of the projections, and these are updated, where the high was actually below the water level by the time you got to 2007. So they started saying, oh boy, we might need to update some of this, which they did. And these are the projections. And you can see at this point in 2010, the sea level was actually the same as the extreme rate. Now, subsequently, because these things, the sea level actually varies over time, it's gone back down slowly. And now it's out, these are outpacing what the actual projection is. But these are projections, right? And so the state selected this high scenario to plug in for us to plug into MCFRM. Why did they pick that one? Well, they picked it because they didn't want to get kind of caught with their pants down, right? So if you under predicted it and you did some designs or did some work and said, well, hey, you guys had this information, you didn't look at it at the right level, you would have been in trouble, right? Now, if it goes slower than that, great. You can just say, hey, what we thought was going to happen in 2030 actually is going to be pushed out more to maybe like, say, 2050. But these were the values the state selected for us to plug into the model. Part of the reason they did that is because if you look at these probabilities up here, and all these things have probabilities associated with them, if you include the specific ice sheet melting that is projected to occur in the Northeast, essentially, if you were down here at this intermediate level, which is kind of that 50th percentile that NOAA is recommending, they're very kind of the same, you're at a coin flip, right? There's a 50% chance it's higher. There's a 50% chance it's lower. And so when you're down there and you're starting to talk about critical infrastructure, you didn't want it to be down to a coin flip. So what the state selected was more this high or this upper bound, which is an up to value, right, on what they would do. Now, if you talk to Rob DeCanto, he thinks that we could be on this red line, right? So we're even, in some respects, the state is below that. So this discussion of that, well, MCFRM is over predicting. No, MCFRM doesn't predict anything, right? Maybe the state has selected a probability level that is much higher than what we think might be occurring, and that's fine, because what we can do with MCFRM is say, okay, we're on this, we modeled stuff on this blue line, but that doesn't mean that you have to follow that blue line with our results. So for example, if you follow the blue line in 2050, right, with 2.5 feet of sea level rise, and you say, that's not actually, what's been happening. It's more close to, say, this green line. Fine. We just go across and we say, okay, we're more like here, if we want to believe that on the green line. So instead of 2050, that might occur in, say, 2075. Great. Just take the 2050 MCFRM results and use them as a 2075. The key is they still provide you that really good physics-based movement of water. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but there's not anything weird happening in MCFRM in terms of the predictions. It's just what the state selected. As far as, there's this thing that was brought up about the NOAA model. There's no NOAA model. There's no NOAA model of physics-based movement of water. There's NOAA projections of sea level rise. So here's what NOAA predicts what would happen in sea level rise, which is a global prediction, and then brought down to specific regional areas in the US. And so they're if you wanted to go to their coin flip level, right at this 50 percentile, which are these bold values, you get curves that are not that dissimilar from what the state uses. It's just a matter of what probability level and what rate you select. So if you're going to select the intermediate 50th percentile rate, well, it's very close to the intermediate state values, which are these black values here, right? And so this is just the data that you put into the model. And if, like I said, if you think 2.5 is going to happen by 2050, great. Then our model results that are presented as 2050 results could be used as 2050. If you think 2.5 is more likely to happen in 2070, fine. Use our 2050 results as 2070. But it's not something that is a problem with the actual physics-based movement of water. It's just all about what you think is going to happen with sea level rise and what you might believe in sea level rise. Some advantages and limitations of the model, just to cover that, so you have a sense. Again, we're focused on that physics-based movement of water, so it really simulates that flow of how the water moves, which is a big improvement and a big difference than bathtub type approaches, where you just say the water goes everywhere based on this level. It's a very high resolution grid, so we get overland resolutions of 3 to 7 meters. We're down to 10 feet in areas. So we're looking at parcel based flooding. And this information is all what went into, kind of looking at Washington Street, downtown Nantucket, and how we should think about and plan for that. It does include tidal structure flow. I mentioned the dams up in Boston that were included. It has all the major coastal structures in it, how it works with that. It has that changing climate, uses 4 different global climate models. I mentioned it's calibrated and validated. And perhaps the biggest thing compared to some of the other, flood projections and not sea level rise, but just where the water would move, is that it's a probabilistic model. So we simulate thousands and thousands of events, not just one that FEMA does, right? 100-year present day condition. We're simulating all kinds of tropical cyclones, extratropical cyclones, ones that have actually occurred historically, and ones that are projected to occur given the changing climate conditions. Those are some of the advantages. It was, by federal highways, this is considered a level 3 approach, which is the highest comprehensive approach you can do for a coastal vulnerability assessment, which is why this was kind of an award-winning approach. Some of the limitations here, the digital elevation model is fixed. So if you're going out to 2070 and there's a whole bunch of projects that happens, or there's erosion on the shoreline, that's not currently included in the model. It's high resolution, but it's not micro resolution. So we don't get down to, every inch or every foot of the landscape. Buildings are not explicitly included. So when you get in very urbanized areas, we have a sub-model that looks at how the water flows around buildings themselves. But we're looking at the state scale, so it floods over the landscape. And we don't have any precipitation built in the model. This is a purely coastal flood-based model, although we do have the same approach for precipitation-based flooding that we've used in a probabilistic approach. So what do you get out of this model? Well, you don't, as I mentioned, just get, hey, here's where it's wet or not. You get actually the probability that you're going to get flooded if a storm comes. And you get that probability over changing climate conditions. So like I said, we simulate thousands and thousands of storms dynamically. Here's an example of that, of a tropical cyclone that comes up and hits the Massachusetts area. This is a 2070 condition. The arrows indicate wind speed. The colors, the pinks, are higher water surface elevation, so that's surge. And you can see as the cyclonic approach of that storm influences an area, what happens. And then we go at a higher resolution scale, again, looking at that wind and the water level. Waves are built into this. You can see how it floods over the landscape. So again, it's looking at how the water physically moves. It has nothing to do with the projections of sea level rise. Each storm is run, and then we look at the distribution of those flooding results from the thousands and thousands of storms we run. What that means is you get this coastal flood exceedance probability. It's not just, hey, I'm wet here or I'm not wet here. If you get a storm, and this is, for example, present day in Boston, you can look at, if we look at that light green, that's a 1%. So it's a 1% chance when the storm comes, you're going to get water in that area. If you get to these darker colors, like say this purple, you're at a 20% chance. What does that mean? So if you check the weather in the morning and you're expecting rain, right? If there's a 2% chance of rain, you probably aren't going to grab your raincoat or your umbrella. If there's 50% chance, probably will, right? So it's that percent chance that you're going to get flooded. So as you get, and that's an annual chance. So every time you can look at this percentage, you're going to say, oh, there's a 50% chance that I'm going to get wet in this area. So these darker areas are more likely or have a higher probability of flooding. And so you can then look across your town, your community, and say, oh, in this case for Boston, if I'm in this light green area here, there's a higher probability I'm going to get flooded here than say in this pink area over here. Why is that important? Well, that can help you prioritize where to take your actions, right? Where to invest your resiliency measures. If you cross that with areas that are important, so for example, the Central Artery Tunnel System, there's a highway operations center right here. If that gets hit, that's a huge deal. So they might be a lot less tolerant for risk. For example, the hospitals, they see the pink anywhere near the hospital and they get nervous, right? If you're Mass DOT and it's a salt shed, they can get near the purples and they're not too nervous because it's just a salt shed. So depending on how important it is, you can start to weigh your probability of flooding with your consequences of flooding to come up with being able to prioritize your risk for looking at adaptations for flooding. That's just present day. So that gives you the spatial risk component, but you also get the temporal risk of flooding. So if you go forward in time, now if you look at the same area here, this is the Greenway up in East Boston, you had a 1% or basically 100-year type water surface elevation return period. But that changes in 2030, given sea level rise increases and storm variations that start to occur. That goes up to a 5% chance. So once every 20 years that you would expect to get water in this area. So you get now how the risk is changing over time. So maybe at a specific area, you're okay with a 1% chance, but a 5% chance might change your viewpoint on things. And if you go to 2070, for example, now that same area is at a 50% chance. So every other year, you could expect that you're going to have flooding in this area based on the storm events that occur and the sea level rise that is projected. Now, as I mentioned, if you don't believe in that high sea level rise rate, maybe this 2070 time is more like 2100, right? And that's okay. The biggest uncertainty in all these things that we're looking at is the sea level rise projections, right? I'm very confident in how the governing equations and mathematical equations of water movement work. Those are well known for centuries. What we don't have a good understanding of is exactly how fast sea level rise might change. But this provides good planning basis for that and can be adjusted over time as we actually see what sea level rise does. You can also get depth of inundation at any probability level you want. So that 100-year or 1% level, you can see the depth of inundation in the Greenway starts at 1 feet. Present day, 2030, it goes up to 2.5. And by 2070, you might be up to 5 to 10 feet in specific areas. So you can also get how deep the water is at any given level. If you wanted to look at the 5% level or the 10% level, you can look at those as well. So the bottom line is this gives you much more workable and usable data to prioritize how to build adaptations and not just, look at a map that NOAA produces or other people that produce that just shows water everywhere. You have no idea what the probability of that occurrence is going to be. You have no idea where to start. And it's a bit overwhelming in those cases. This provides actual workable, usable data for prioritization. Just a couple of examples of how people are using it. So this is a This is a current fuel depot complex in Milton, Massachusetts. This is I-93 that runs up towards Boston. Here's kind of the present day flood risk. It is in a FEMA flood zone. Our model results also predicted that. Again, this has nothing to do with climate change right now. This is, 1% risk. You can see the high resolution model. You can see this little tidal creek that has a higher probability of flooding. Anyway, they were translating this area over to be their primary District 6 maintenance facility, as opposed to just their fuel depot complex. Meaning, if a storm came through, everything would mobilize out of here. Trucks, plows, all that kind of stuff. The engineer was designing and said, oh, wait, this looks like a pretty risky zone due to FEMA. And we said, yeah, it looks that way. They asked us how long or how deep the water would be during that 1% or 100-year level. It, was only about a half a foot. They could still get there down Granite Avenue here into the facility, and we could identify where the flooding was coming from, how long it would flood during the peak of the storm. They said, okay, we can design around that. Well, the smart person at Mass DOT said, well, wait a minute, if we're going to do this, we want this facility to operate at least 50 years. And what does it look like if we just go forward to 2030 or maybe 2050 if you think sea level rise is a slower rate? Well, you can see then here that risk changed from that 1% up to that 20% level, which means you're going to have much more frequent flooding. It's a lot deeper. And during the heart of the storm, you're not actually going to be able to get to the facility or get out of the facility to go get your plows and trucks during a winter storm. And you have 10 hours of flooding there. So they canceled the whole project, said this is not a good site to do our main maintenance facility for District 6, which is Boston's site. So the site in Hingham, very simple. This is stuff we've used for Nantucket as well. Looking at a Mill Street pump station, which is in a flood zone today. The risk of that flooding in the future in 2030 was a depth of a foot. But you can see by 2070, which is the red line, you get up to 3 feet of flooding. This black line here was a critical elevation of the electrical equipment in this little pump facility. So very simply, they could use our information, our data to say, well, hey, we're okay if the water gets around this, but we just can't have the pump get down with the electrical. So they just raise the electrical stuff in the building up to an appropriate level, 12 and a half, so that they were protected against a 1% 2070 type storm event that bought them 50 years, to make sure that the pump station was okay. Low-lying roads, this is in Sandwich. This is happening throughout the Cape, looking at the probability of flooding over time. So all these little colors indicate, the miles of road that would be affected by a certain probability of flooding. So if we're at the 100%, that's every year, 2.9 miles of road get wet, which is not surprising. This is Spring Hill Beach area, which does flood pretty regularly. And then we look at how that evolves over time as you go to 2050, 2070. You can start to see how the road miles are affected. You can cross that with the criticality of the roads, evacuation routes. Route 6 is obviously pretty important there. How critical the road is. If you put those two together, meaning the criticality of the road versus the risk of flooding, you can start to identify and prioritize where your action should take place, right? So the red here is areas where the town said, we're going to really focus on how we're going to make our transportation network work along these red and orange levels, because those are the most critical, as well as the highest risk of flooding areas. Maybe we don't need to worry too much about the yellow locations right away because there's lower consequence of flooding. There's also this data is publicly available for anybody to get and use, and I'll show you that in a second. There's also level 2 data. I'll just wrap this up pretty quickly. But if you really want to get into what the future tidal datums are, what mean high water is in the future, what mean tide level, mean low or low water, that's all provided in the data online. There's water surface elevation information at every probability level, or 6 probability levels. Here it is for Nantucket in 2070 at that 1%. So you can look at what's my water surface elevation projected to be at that 1% storm level, or that 100-year level under the state standard sea level rise projections. You can also get wave heights out of the model. So skipping ahead to Nantucket again, here's wave height information. Again, at that 2070, 100 year level, what you could expect to see in terms of wave heights across the island. Obviously, there's not huge waves in interior areas, right? Down to 0 feet. It's just, flooding with some small, but there's big waves out in certain areas that affect the coast. So you can look at what the waves are in the harbor, for example, under 2070 storm conditions. And again, if you think that sea level rise isn't pacing that fast, that's fine. That 2070 just becomes 2100 or 2110 or whatever you think the sea level rise, when you're going to reach that sea level rise, the time frame that you're at. Also provides design flood elevations, which is the combination of the waves with the water levels. So you can look at individual properties. This is a site in Boston. You can look at the water surface elevations, how that evolves over time. You get actual data. This is all publicly available. I'll show you where to get it. It's not, none of the data is proprietary, or you don't have to pay for us to get it or any of that stuff. Wave heights in that same area, design flood elevations in that same area. It's available in a lot of locations online. CZMs, if you just want to view it, you just want to look at it, Coastal Zone Management of Massachusetts has a sea level rise and coastal flood viewer, which has a Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model tab, and you can look at the flooding probabilities that we went through, those exceedance probabilities. You can look at that over the different climate horizons. You can look at that at flood depth levels. It's a state standard, these results. You can get this through the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool for the state, and this covers the entire state of Massachusetts. So you can draw a box around anywhere, and then it will give you the maps. It'll give you the recommended flood levels for design. It actually doesn't dictate one level to use. It gives you, which is really important, flexible adaptation. So it gives you a lower value to use and a higher value depending on what the consequence of the area is, the design you might be doing. And this is, something that's required by the state right now in a lot of communities. So Cambridge, for example, has their own viewer, their own maps, all based on MCFRM stuff. They tend to go to that high level because they want, no chance of exceedance, right? And so even though the projections, are following or the state standard of that high trend, they're going with that. Other communities might offer, a different viewpoint on that based on what you think sea level rise is going to do. There's also you want any of this data, it's available on our website. You can just go to woodsholegroup.com and show you right here. There's you go to innovation, there's a Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model page. It gives you a little bit of background that I gave you today, explains the different types of data. There's a series of training workshops available that cover the basic data. A lot of this stuff I went through today. If you really want to learn more about the model and how it was developed, how it works, what the data are, how do you apply the data, there's a series of these 3 workshops, and they're YouTube videos that you can watch. So there's very good information available on that. And as I mentioned, all of this is publicly available. It's free, doesn't cost anything. You can download level 1, level 2 data for all of Nantucket, all of the state if you want. You just need to put in, this little information, submit, and you'll have access to the data right from our website. This includes all the data. There's nothing kept from anybody. So the model data is not proprietary, regularly available to anybody. The model itself requires, basically space computers to run, if you can imagine, because it's very high resolution, covers the whole state. It actually covers the whole Atlantic Ocean and Gulf of Mexico. So the model itself is almost impossible to run. That you can't download the model, but you can download all of the model results. The model itself is something that nobody would really be able to run without the software and everything like that. It's updated approximately every the goal is every 10 years. The initial project was developed in 2013. It was actually updated 4 years after that. We currently have an inquiry to update it again. So it was released in 2021. It's now 2024. So although we say 10 years, it looks like it might be updated frequently. What's the big updates on these things? Well, we always are trying to improve stuff in the model, but the real update to these is, as you'd expect, these curves, right? Because we learn more as we go forward, and then these curves are adjusted over time. And so, you know, I know there was some discussion of like, well, MCFRM isn't anywhere close. We should use the NOAA model. NOAA doesn't have a model. There is no NOAA model of physics-based movement of water. There's NOAA projections of sea level rise, just like there's Massachusetts projections of sea level rise. Whatever projections you want to use can easily be applied into our model. So that the question isn't MCFRM. The question is, what sea level rise projections do you want to use? So that's what I had. Hopefully you guys, that was a lot. I know there's a lot of information here. But hopefully that was useful to understand a little bit where this came from, what goes into it, what you can get out of it. As I mentioned, all this information was used for looking at Washington Street. It was also integrated into the island-wide resiliency plan that was completed by Arcadis, which we provided all that data to them. It's good, solid data. It's what the state uses. It's what the state recommends. And the sea level rise values are the state standard for this. It's that up to value amount. So I'll stop there. And if there's questions, great. Again, I know that was a lot to take in.
All right, great, Kirk. Thank you. I know there's going to be questions. Doug will have something, and then I have something to say after that. So go ahead, Doug.
Thank you, Peter, and Kirk. Great presentation. I'm a layperson, so I'm not going to try to tread on territory that's better left for technical experts to ask you about. But I did have one sort of call out. I noticed in the presentation a particular slide that caught my attention. I thought it might be useful for CRAC to consider, just as a way to revisit the whole discussion about how to prioritize where we ought to be putting our attention on resilience projects. And it has to do with that low-lying roads risk results in Sandwich, where you kind of cross-referenced what's the risk of, flood risk or what have you. But you also then added another axis, which had to do with what's the criticality of that route. And I thought that was the kind of thing we were struggling to try to articulate when we were going through our list. We were like, what's in the top 10 of our resilience projects? And I think that would be an interesting way for us to approach our own prioritization in Nantucket. I don't know if that sort of thing is available specific to Nantucket, or is that the kind of judgment we have to make? Is Mattocket Road more critical than, Marsh Road? Those sorts of things, I guess, is where I'm kind of. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's really great point. Really, so we've done, and you guys can do this too. Like, it doesn't require us. There's these vulnerability assessments that prioritize actions, and it goes beyond more than just roadways, right? Like it's any town asset. So parks, town hall, buildings. We've done it for Falmouth, Palm Beach, Florida, a number of different places. But essentially, it's taken that probability of flooding, right, and crossing that with the criticality of each individual asset. We've worked with towns before. We actually give out surveys and interview like town officials and take surveys to gather information on the overarching criticality of all the various assets, match that up with the probability of flooding. And it's kind of interesting where that lies, because you may have something that has, say, a 0.2% chance of flooding, right, in a certain climate horizon. But the criticality is like through the roof important, right? And that jumps over things that might have a 10 to 20% chance of flooding just because of the criticality. And so that produces a really nice chart that basically lays out where the prioritized projects should go. And if you get a cluster of them, you might have a regional project, right? Where you can do something like Washington Street, where you really have a lot of criticality in that area, where you want to do that. So that's been really, really effective for a lot of communities to really think through where their projects need to a lot of times, people look at, some future map 2070, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it today. Anything you can do to buy time to see what actually happens with these projections is really valuable, right? And so you might be able to put that off, say, until I reach a tipping point. We talked a little bit about this with the DAP stuff too, for the dynamic adaptation pathways. Like if sea level rise gets up to X, now I'm at a point where I'm like, okay, I have to make an investment or at least start planning for this specific project or this specific area. So it's a really good, valuable point to bring up. I think it's really critical to think about that prioritization piece. And communities can do this themselves because the data is available and you can measure your own criticality, and it's just simple math at that point. So.
Okay, I'm gonna go all over the place. We've created our CRP. We all know that. We're in public outreach mode right now. Anything we can do to reach people, to get them to understand that the water is coming up, that you need to prepare for that, you need to plan for that, and alter your lives to be ready for that. I'm going to find myself going back to this example. The further we get into this, there's a house near the end of Loretta Lane, and it's going up right now, and it's level with a wetland just across the road and pretty much level with the harbor. And those people didn't get the memo. I don't know if they built that to floodplain standards, but that house is going to get wet sooner than later. I just think we need, as a town, as a committee, for property owners, one model that we're going to go to so that people can get that, and the data, and we need the members of our, regulatory boards and their administrators to be familiar and conversant in these models and the data, so that when projects in areas where we know stuff's going to go bad, they can speak the language to the property owner and say, we know this is happening. You can go look at this model. You can go get this information. At the very least, these property owners doing developments, the town itself, their engineers need to be conversant in this. They need to be updated on it. Their attorneys, all the people involved. It can't be a situation where they start building and go, oh, gee, I just found out about this. Oh, what are we going to do? And then here we go down the road. They've built the house. The storm comes and they look to the town to help them out when we've been trying to help them out all along. It's frustrating me when I see projects like that, or you hear people, we all hear about the pools that people want to build right behind the dunes where we know the water's going to wash over and fill up that pool, or whatever it is. We just need to, I don't know, we need to be able to reach people, and we're trying to do that. And one of the reasons we had you come, Kirk, is because I believe the Conservation Commission was trying to take whatever model is going to work at the time. And I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but we need to be able to refer to one model, the one that's going forward, and not have people pick a model that works for them. It has to be a model that we've also subscribed to, so that that's the one we're working off of. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think it makes complete sense. And I share your seen a lot of projects going on just because people are uninformed about what's happening, right? The state's trying to really push this information out there as best they can. Those training sessions had, 500 plus people at each of those. But maybe that's, still not enough. all I can say is, the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model is what the state is using as the standard. It's what they're pushing as a standard. It's consistent. The data, the way it's presented is consistent across the entire state. It does provide flexibility for, and there's certain cases where you might not be able to make a certain level because it creates, an island, or it creates, problems with connections or utilities, and that's totally understood, and we get that. But it is the state standard. You can choose to believe or not to believe the sea level rise rates. Like I said, I think that's fine. That's up to people. But the model itself is what the state's pushing is the standard, and it's been peer reviewed. It's been used now for the last 5 years pretty consistently. So I still think it is the right choice. I understand that there's questions over the sea level rise rates that go into it, and that it will be updated in the future.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, thank you, Kirk, because I feel like I was definitely one that was very hesitant, especially when we first started using MCFRM, because it wasn't as broadly available. If I remember correctly, when Vince first brought it to us years ago, I'm still, so like, I know that, everything you presented, and I think you did a great job of explaining all the inputs, and the physics-based model of where the water flows. And I think I have no doubt that this is the best model, especially the most up-to-date for the island and Massachusetts generally. My concern, or for the committee, is when we are recommending, what people need to look at, right? And so what we're sort of, the things that we have come up with in the past of like the recommendations we're making are, it's more about what the output is. It's not the model. It's not the, the sea level rise projections specifically. It's like, what output are people looking at? And yes, if you're a consultant, if you're designing a huge project and you kind of need all this input, this is like the best, most technical model. But if someone's just wants a snapshot of like, I'm considering buying this house, or I'm, whatever it is, it first of all needs to be sort of simplistic. In a sense of like, maybe we decide what exact model output it is and just have like, this is what we're doing and what we present. But I am concerned with having to explain to people to do a crosswalk of, okay, the sea level rise projections are outdated at this point. They're from 2012. I think that's the citation that was in the presentation. And so saying like, yes, I understand, because it's about feet, you can say, well, that's actually, instead of 2050 now it's 2070. But if we're trying to use it as a planning thing, like the most recent time we were discussing this was for the CONCOM regulation changes, I think we need to be very clear. Like it needs to be either like this output at high scenario on this timeline and like these feet projections. Because I think two things. First, we want to be the most accurate in what we're telling the community and what we're pointing to, but also we don't want to create loopholes, and we don't want to take away our authority. If we say like use this, and then people can clearly say, well, these are old projections, or so I mean, one of my big concerns was that the inputs were kind of older, but as you said, Kirk, that there is a plan to update them. So that was one of my biggest concerns. I mean, at least, I know we're not comparing, you didn't like the comparison of model to projections, but when we're telling the community what to look at, like we know that NOAA is updated very regularly. And so there's that consistency. And so this is like a lot to say to the committee, but to you, Kirk, my question is, are the updates considered regular at this point by the state, or are they like when someone requests it, when there's grant money? I feel like that's a little almost too fluid for me to feel comfortable with.
Yeah, so all good questions and all fair. So I will say that, the sea level rise projections that went into MCFRM are not 2012. That was the Boston Harbor flood risk model. So they were updated. They're at the same IPC. I mean, so basically when IPCC releases projections, that's when NOAA on a federal level does their review of the projections. That's also when the state does their review of projections. So in terms of sea level rise projections, I think what we're using here in MCFRM was 2017 based. NOAA came up with stuff in 2020 or 2022. But to be honest with you, they're not that different. they're very subtly different. So the key is just the spread comes in terms of what that probability level you pick is, right? So NOAA has the same projections and higher than what are in MCFRM if you pick, say, the 85th percentile of the projections. If you pick the midpoint, the 50th percentile, you know, you could pick the 50th percentile of the Massachusetts projections will be very, very close to the 50th percentile of the NOAA projections. They're all coming from the same place, right? IPCC, the scientists are all the same. They release the projections. NOAA does some things with it. The state does some things with it. It's really about, do you predict, you know, do you want the 85th percentile where it's most likely not to exceed? Do you want the 50th percentile that's most likely to succeed? So that's, you know, where this message is. And so what the state has done, right or wrong, is say, look, we're going to pick an up to amount. That's really what they're saying. It's like, we want to pick it's up to this. It's very probable. It's almost impossible that it's going to be higher than that, right? If you pick that intermediate level, right, that 50th percentile level, again, it's that 50% chance it could be higher, 50% chance it would be lower. In terms of how much it's updated, like I think, you know, like I said, it's looked like it's been updated on a 5-year time frame for the state. And I also understand what you're saying and give a lot of credence to that. It's got to be simple, right? And so a lot of this stuff, I agree with you, is for a little bit. It's a little bit more technical. It's a little bit more on the, you know, design and engineering side of things. But the state viewers that they have put out really do try to simplify it quite a bit. So they'll have things like, what's the 1% chance of flooding extent, right? It's just one color. That's a map that shows here's, you know, where the 100-year floodplain would be expected in 2050, for example. Or if you don't want to think about it in terms of a time scale, with 2 feet of sea level rise. And then you can say over what time frame you think that might occur. So I don't know if that helps at all, but I will say there's not substantial difference in the sea level rise projections. It's really what probability level or what curve you're going to pick, because the scientists never make things simple, right? So scientists at the state level and at IPCC says, well, we're not going to just give you one projection because that would be too simple, right? And we might be wrong. So they give you 6, right? Of like, well, what happens with the carbon emissions and what happens with this probability versus that probability? So you get all these curves, which gets really confusing. You know, in my viewpoint, you can argue what's right or wrong. I think there's problems with picking the 50th percentile because you are on that coin flip. There's also problems with picking the high one. But this, from the state's perspective, and I'll give them credit with this, at least with a high one, you're not going to be, you know, caught in a situation where all of a sudden it does go fast as some of the scientists predict or faster. And now you're in a position where you design everything to the 50th percentile and now you're stuck. So.
Thanks, Kirk. I appreciate it. RJ, we're going to wait till the end to do public comment. So just, you can lower your hand. I'll remember you and we'll get back to you when all the members are done. Leah, go ahead.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Kirk. That was a great presentation. Couple questions. So when you go and download all of the data that you showed on your website, is it possible for us to upload that onto our town GIS? So years ago, we used to have those layers, but now they don't work anymore. That's my first question.
Yep. So those are all ARC compatible, GIS compatible files that you can download, and many towns have downloaded them and put them up on their own town viewers. Salem has, Cambridge has, a number of Cape towns have. and again, I could show you. You could go on the state viewers if you're familiar with the Morris data viewer.
Mhm.
What the state has, all our data is on there for viewing, and then that coastal zone sea level rise and flood viewer has all the data on there. But our data you can download directly. It is the GIS data that you can put right into any town system.
Okay, okay, I'll update that on ours. And then question about the climate resilience design standard tool that you kind of touched on. Would you recommend, I will say I haven't explored it that much, but I know in the Conservation Commission's proposed updates, they had kind of referred to MCFRM, which you had recommended against. Would you recommend having the design standard tool in the regulations for engineers to go to and
I mean, it
use
is, yeah, it is what the state is pushing. MCFRM is, I mean, it covers all the climate risks, just so you know. So it also covers heat and precipitation in there. So when you have a specific project, and all the state-based funded projects have to do it. So if you have a state-funded project or a state grant-funded project, you have to use the Coastal Resilience Design Standards tool. You just plug in your parcel in there. You have to take this little quiz that really references, your consequences of flooding or your criticality of that particular site. And then it spits out the information that you should think about from a design standards level. So that is something you could look at. And what we've seen across the state is that, again, all the state projects have to do it, but more and more the regulatory agencies are pointing to it as something that you need to consider. The actual, design regulations, right, aren't caught up quite yet, right? So they still, are at a different level. But in terms of the regulatory, they want you to look at it and they ask those questions. So it's definitely something you should explore a little bit more.
Okay. And then my last question is, it's probably an easy question, but for the colors of probabilities that you guys chose, generally, red is like high risk, but you chose to use the blue color. What's the reason?
Yeah,
Water?
so a couple of things. If you download the data, it comes with a standard layer file that is the state standard, which was, we decided with the state to use for that distribution. However, the actual GIS data has all the probabilities in there. So you can present it any way you want. It doesn't have the bins, 50, 100, 20, 30. If you wanted to look at the 46.2% risk level, it's in there. And you want to change the color scheme, go for it. So it was, it's a little bit, backwards from a risk perspective. Higher risk areas, at the 100% means once a year level are the darker blue. Whereas the low probability risk levels, that 1,000 year, are the pink. Generally, the state said we don't like red. So we tried to stay away from red.
Okay, thanks, Kirk.
Thanks, Leah, and thank you, Kirk. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, just a couple comments. I don't know if I have a question, but I think for this committee, we could get sort of, we could get stuck. We could get paralyzed by the numbers and what do we use and is this right and how often do we update it, all the details. I think what we should be thinking about is, being conservative and erring on the higher side. And I feel comfortable in that because if we're going to do triggers and pathways, and these changes are going to be triggered by things that happen on the ground, if we, which we learned a couple weeks ago, then I think that we're okay. We've planned for the worst and we're hoping for the best, and we are making, the right choices when we need to make them. And I think we have to be careful not to be paralyzed by all the data. That's, sort of, I think there's questions that we need to move on to at some point to start doing what people are asking for earlier. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Are there other comments from committee members? Okay, Gary.
Thanks, Peter. I caught most of the presentation. I thought it was terrific. And I think what the concern that I hear from my colleagues on the committee is that we can't not have some question about what's the right standard. When you think about the applications being made to various regulatory groups, we can't have a free-for-all every time where there's a battle about which standard is going to be the one that controls, and ask the various regulatory committees that to become the scientists to decide which one. So therefore, my view is that whatever the state has adopted as its rule, that's what we ought to be using. And that'll give some certainty to the applicants. That'll give certainty to the public. And yes, if somebody decides to challenge it, and they can go to the courts, and maybe some courts might actually challenge some of the use of the state standards. But I think for the most part, we ought to stick with what the state of Massachusetts has determined to be the standards by which these rules are governed. And that would avoid a lot of uncertainty that would otherwise come if we have more than one standard that people can use every time they make an application. So that's just my view.
Thank you, Gary. Yeah, I totally agree with that. All right, are there other?
Sorry, Peter. I'll just jump in and say, I think, Gary, and I agree with you too as well. And I think it's important to remember that this is obviously an evolving science in some regards, right? And it's not going to, it's not like you're stuck at this level forever, right? It is going to be updated, right? And it is going to evolve and it is going to change. But you're right in saying the state picked this for a reason, and it is the standard. And if you go and say, well, I just don't think that's the right one, I'm going to pick this one because I like it better. That's what the state was trying to get away from, because that's what was happening before this came out, was everybody was just picking whatever they wanted because there's so many different projections that occur. And right, of course, certain projections are lower, certain are higher, right? So you can get really, to Matt's point, get really stuck in the numbers really quickly. And if you don't have a standard, great. And my other point, which I've said a number of times to you guys, which I think is really important, is you can't get it wrong if you're picking at the higher end of the probabilities, right? Yes, maybe there's some over design, but all that means is it's going to work longer, right? If you at all believe in any kind of the data that shows sea level rise is occurring, maybe it doesn't accelerate, okay? Fine, then what you've done is going to work longer and last longer, right? But if you go the other way and say, well, it's just not happening that fast, great. I'm not disagreeing with that. That could be the case. But now you're in a situation where it's not going to work as long, and you could have disastrous results from that. So,
Great. Thank you very much, Kirk. Are there other comments from committee members? Okay, public comment. Go ahead, RJ.
Thank you, Chair Brace. RJ Turcott on behalf of the Nantucket Land and Water Council. Thank you so much for the presentation, Mr. Bosma. I personally love using the bathtub models online and think they're a great tool. And some of the things you said today makes me want to bring you along to some of the Conservation Commission meetings where we're trying to get folks to design to the higher projections and build wisely, and to think ahead a little bit further than in what our coastal resilience plan says, and referring to the length of a typical life of a mortgage, which is about 30 years. I was involved back in 2022 as part of the Land and Water Council with incorporating the language of the coastal resilience plan into the new wetlands updates. And at the time, MCRFM had been a lot newer, had just come out, and we just wrote it in to the wetlands bylaw, thinking that that was going to be the way to go going forward based on what was coming out. And commenting at the last meeting for the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee, as well as the Conservation Commission meeting where we were discussing wetlands regulations updates. The part of it that is giving us pause at the Land and Water Council right now is something that Mr. Beller mentioned a moment ago, and that is Nantucket is kind of a one-of-a-kind place. It is not like the little town I'm from, Millbury, Massachusetts. Nantucket, if something can be challenged legally, it will be challenged. And so coming from that angle back towards using MCFRM, which I really, really want to be able to apply to pretty much to everything going forward. The issue that we're having is that when NOAA released its 2022 projections and data, it also released a technical report, and that's all in one PDF on all the information, how they came to those conclusions. The Army Corps, NASA, you name it, were involved, EPA, and they also, with that technical report, release an implementation guide for the powers that be, whether you're a regulatory body or a homeowner. It's all in one PDF, and it's accessible, and it explains how to apply these to your properties. And in looking at the page for using the tool for MCFRM, there's this disclaimer at the bottom that says the viewer is designed as a general planning tool to support broad-scale vulnerability assessments and identification of potential adaptation strategies consistent with CZM's Storm Smart Coast program. This product should not be used for legal, engineering, surveying, or other purposes. And then it goes on to say site-specific assessments of elevations or boundaries, partial structure, or other should be made by a certified survey professional, which is all well and good. But when the commission is trying to apply the regulations that they're about to adopt, the part that is the lawyers, I can see it now, are going to jump all over is this product should not be used for legal, and the wetlands bylaw is a legally binding document, which is why I've been saying maybe we should take a step back and not specifically mention MCRFM, at least for now, until that technical report is available and the implementation guide is available. I know it's still developing, but that was what has been giving us pause. So I just wanted to bring that up at this meeting. So thank you for hearing me, and it was a great presentation again.
Thanks, RJ.
Peter, can we have Kirk respond to that if he has a?
Yeah, just you
comment?
gotta understand that we've got 35 minutes left in the meeting and one more thing to do, and that person's been waiting to do that presentation, and we want to hear what he has to say. So go ahead with that in mind.
Yeah, so I mean, that original disclaimer was put on the data back in BHFRM days. We are still trying to work through the final documentation for the MCFRM release. I think, you know, we're obviously trying to cover our butts a little bit on some of this from a legal perspective as well. And the reason we do that is not because, again, of the model, but it's because we're taking projections in from other scientists that really formulate the foundation of all this. And there's no way to have, I mean, any certainty levels with those projections, right? And that's really the problem. So when somebody projects something out to 2070, and the difference between the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile is 3 feet, that's where we're putting that disclaimer piece in there. That's why.
Great, thank you, Kirk. All right, is there any other public comment? All right, good discussion, and I'm glad that you can make it, Kirk, and please be on standby. I'm sure we're going to need you again.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Peter, and Leah. Thanks for inviting me. Always happy to talk with you guys. You guys are a great group, good questions, listen well, all those things. So really, really impressed with this group of people here.
All right, thank you. We're going to jump right into presentation and discussion on Area Association Survey results by Peter Morrison, co-president of the Nantucket Civic League. You're all set, Peter.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me, and Lee is going to handle the 3 slides that I have. I wanted to say I wouldn't have missed this for the world, Kirk, because I think everything you said it kind of exemplifies a famous quote, which was that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. A famous economist or mathematician. The reason that this kind of model that just heard about is useful is because it imposes probabilistic thinking on how we deal with these kinds of uncertainties going forward, and the fact that they change over time, and we have to envision various scenarios. I'm here to talk about something that's kind of at the other spectrum, the other end of the spectrum, which is the survey that you all have had done. And I'm viewing it from the perspective of being co-president of the Nantucket Civic League, which, as most of you know, is the umbrella organization for our 25 local neighborhood associations. And as co-president, I foresee that members of these autonomous neighborhood associations are going to regard themselves going forward as stakeholders in the town's coastal resilience plan. They're going to do so for varied reasons, highly varied reasons, in local contexts. With coastal resilience, as with politics, everything is local. The coastal resilience plan calls for delineating coastal resilience districts and sub-districts, essentially small areas where a suitable intervention will address what is perceived to be a chronic problem or a developing chronic problem. The concerns within and among neighborhoods are likely to foster coalitions among neighbors who support what they regard as credible solutions to these local problems, whether it's erosion, whether it's recurrent local flooding, or whatever afflicts neighbors. So what we got now here is the raw data from this survey of residents who were concerned enough to volunteer to take this survey, which means that this is by no means a representative sample, but it is a sample that can be informative and useful when you look at it from a particular perspective that I do. If you could put up the first slide, I guess the second slide, I want to start talking, with respect to the map of Civic League neighborhoods. Leah, thanks. Okay, the next one after this. I want to keep this up just because I'm going to be talking about what's going on in different neighborhoods that we in the Civic League identify in terms of the different colors here. You kind of know where most of them are, but the exact boundaries you may not be aware of just in terms of, who's within or outside of a particular area. The first thing you want to know about this survey is that the respondents are self-selected. They're the ones who volunteered to take the survey. So their answers are not representative of all Nantucket residents, which means we don't want to look at it from that perspective. However, their responses do reflect, and very clearly, what's on the minds of those among us who are presently concerned with coastal resilience. So my first key point here is that the survey does reflect contemporary public understanding and concerns. And what this means is that we can map geographically those among us who are actively concerned. And what I mean by this is that we can spot neighborhoods where the respondents here are overrepresented, or conversely, where they're totally absent, which means that they didn't care enough to want to take the survey, barometer, As an example, the Nantucket Town Association is one of the Civic League's neighborhood associations. You know sort of where it is, and maybe you can make out the name, the name of the thing on the map. There, it's pointed. This association has 48 or so members paying dues, represents less than 3% of all 2,000 Civic League members. However, those of them who volunteered to respond to this survey from the town association account for 12% of everyone who responded to your survey. Conversely, there are 8 of the Civic League's 25 neighborhood associations who aren't represented at all among your survey respondents. Virtually no one from these 8 associations volunteered to voice an opinion. And that's probably an indication that coastal resilience isn't yet an issue among those neighbors. Overall, I found that 4 of our 25 neighborhood associations collectively account for 4/5 of all your survey respondents. 4 of the 25 neighborhoods, 82% of your survey respondents. So this survey's immediate value is, in my opinion, that it can help you identify where today's most actively concerned folks are concentrated. That's the truth that you can wring out of a survey that is by no means representative. You can spot where the action is. And the short answer here is Sconset, which is the Civic League's largest neighborhood association by membership. Sconset has 335 members, and they account for 19% of all the survey respondents. The Nantucket Town Association would account for an additional 13%. So when you put together both these neighborhoods, you got 32% of your survey respondents. And that's an interesting way to think about, where you might find some useful information. Which makes my second point, which is that either of these 2 neighborhoods would be a prime candidate for an initial demonstration effort to show that there is public support for addressing coastal resilience within particular neighborhoods where the residents are actively concerned about coastal resilience and presumably are going to be receptive or relatively more receptive to implementing solutions. Now, why don't you, Leah, put up the next slide, which is going to get the summary points that I want to be on the screen while I go through the rest of what I have to say, so you won't forget them. Like I say, the survey portrays the current state of public understanding and concern, and I think it validates the proposed formation of coastal resilience districts and sub-districts. It shows that we could do it, and we could do it in the right place. And it also shows how residents' concerns vary across neighborhoods. And I think the survey results point to where an initial pilot effort might succeed. So that's kind of the big picture as I see it. And in closing, I'll call attention to one very informative survey question, which asked, from your perspective, how can the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee and the town's coastal resilience plan help your neighborhood within our capacity? And the top choices of all the respondents were informational presentations and best practices brochures. So I haven't tortured the data or tried to tease out subtle insights. I just kind of looked at them and I said, you've got some people speaking out here. We know where they are. They're telling us some things that are useful, and you need to pick a place or two where you want to pilot the application, or at least the drawing and creation of coastal resilience districts and sub-districts. And I think you've got at least two and maybe more Civic League neighborhoods where I think there's a good chance that the members will want to engage. So that's about all I have to say, and I can answer any questions you have.
All right, thank you, Peter. Matt Fee already has a question. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Peter, which neighborhoods are likely to engage
I'm
in the data?
I'm hypothesizing that the ones that are likely to engage are the ones that are most inclined to want to answer the survey. And by engage, I mean they're looking at it saying, you know, we want to do something about this. And we'd like to know how to work together rather than oppose what you're trying to do. I mean, you know, they're going to either oppose what you want to do, or you're going to meet, you know, you're going to somehow work together to say, we've got some proven methods. I mean, and I'm working here off of the confidence that I have in the incredibly, you know, well thought out program as a whole, and the way Vince has thought about, you know, wanting to move forward with actions that are going to have to be adapted and monitored and, you know, fashioned. And I think that's an approach that would appeal to people when they hear about it, rather than having something dictated, well, we're going to go do this, and if you don't like it, sorry.
Linda, we're going to take public comment at the end, so you can just, anyway. It's interesting that, Peter, that Matticat residents, 2.43%. And you have one Bruce Mandel who has been to a number of the Harbor Plan Update Committee meetings to press the Matticat Conservation Association's issues. I would think Matticat would be one, even though they had low numbers contributing to the survey, they would be willing to engage with us. I mean, they're gonna be, you know, they're a danger zone for sure.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that there are a number of danger zones, you know, that correspond to some of our neighborhoods where nobody bothered to take the survey. Now, that's not a sure indicator. It just may be that, you know, not enough people saw it, or they didn't happen to run into it. So you don't have a true negative. What you have is a possibility of a false negative. But the important thing here is that your survey has revealed some definite, strong positives. There are at least two of them, and I could probably pick out two more, but I don't think you're going to be going out and starting 10 different projects in 10 different places all at once. You probably want to show that you can work with a Civic League neighborhood that is actively concerned, because they obviously see that they're stakeholders, and you can find your way to a model of collaborating with the particular interests of neighborhoods that become actively concerned, and say, we want to work with you. And that leaves open the prospect of saying, well, here are some things that we would propose doing for the peculiar problem that is manifesting itself in some corner of your neighborhood or across your neighborhood. How do you think we ought to handle this? Here's what we think you ought to do. And as co-president, what I'm saying is we can make that interface happen, you know, I think, by communicating to our association presidents that this can either become a workable, productive relationship, or it can devolve into an adversarial, standoff. And I don't know where that leads, but I think it's the way to success is to give it to try.
Well, I would say, we have our priorities of projects that need to get done, and they may not necessarily be in line with what your member associations want to do at any given time. So I would say that hopefully they can hold their positive feelings toward us working with them until we get to them, and that they understand by hopefully reading the plan that we've got our things that we need to do. I know we've talked about on this committee the low-hanging fruit, and also the fruit that will bear more fruit, projects that we'll do early on because we need to do them, but also because we need to show the public that the CRP is serious, and we need to do these projects also for public awareness of the CRP and sea level rise. And I'm pointing to the raising of the road at Folgers Marsh. I'm talking about the sort of southwest corner of Pulpus Road where it goes by Sackatchew Pond. I'm talking about First and Second Bridge, and that section of the road from the third entrance of the DPW all the way past Second Bridge, raising the road and creating proper bridges, potential protection of the downtown area, of course, but the Surfside wastewater treatment plant, all things that have pressing need right now. Hopefully the area associations that are, that have those areas within them will see the logic of us having to do those now and understand that their issues may not be on our priority list right away. We're not denying them because we don't want to work with them. We're denying them because the priorities right now are the ones that are up here. Do I make sense to you?
Yeah, that all makes sense as a way of elaborating on how the process will unfold in the immediate future. And excuse me, I don't know, how many of these more or less immediate interventions are being queued up. But I'm saying with regard to this survey, you know a little bit more about where you might find success in certain places, or possibly in other places where you may need to just provide more information. I mean, like I said with that last question, people have said, would like to have more information. And that's a good starting point. But if you want to start with a pilot demonstration of what you do about local flooding in a portion of a neighborhood, just wheel out what Vince has to say about the approach that's being, considered, because I know that he is looking into these things, in a way that one has to see that they have relevance to a particular problem in a particular place. And all you need to do is persuade the actively concerned members of some of our associations, and they turn into, hopefully, people who will support doing this as voters.
Well, I'm going to take a leap of faith here and say maybe it'd be a good idea if you had myself and Vincent and Leah to your upcoming President's Breakfast in June, where we might do a brief presentation so that you have all your chiefs right there and they can hear us, and they can ask us.
I was hoping you'd ask if that was a possibility.
Well, they can ask us questions, and we can provide hopefully maybe hard copy documentation and the links that they need, and then they can go back to their annual meetings that they'll have throughout the summer and say, we've seen what's going on and it's legit, and they're with us. And I mean, we're in public, like I said, we're in public outreach mode. The more we can reach to the public, right down to the person at home, and say, hey, this is what we're doing, the better for us to get our message out. So if you could consider us for that, I know we'd all oblige with, 100%.
I'll get I'll get moving on it right away with Charlie Stack.
Okay. Is there any other committee member comments? Gary?
Yeah, I think a couple of comments. First, I think Peter's right that the responses that were received were not uniform. In my view, a lot of the reason for that depends upon the degree to which the presidents of these various associations felt it important and pushed their membership to actually volunteer and fill out these questionnaires. I think some of them did, and I think many of them did not. And that's why the results are a little bit skewed toward a handful of associations. I think one of the issues that we still have to concern ourselves with in terms of public outreach, when I hear Peter talking about the 2 or 3 items that we're currently moving forward on, none of those are very critical to the island. None of them. What's really critical to the island are infrastructure issues that are not quite as time sensitive currently. And so what our committee really has to be able to do going forward is to make sure there's a balance, that people understand the critical issues which relate to our infrastructure, and then know also that we also will help them work on local issues that affect their current neighborhood, but probably don't have any impact at all on 2/3 of the other neighborhoods on the island. And that's the balance that we have to continue moving forward on, so the public hears about both of those different types of issues.
Good points, Gary. Thank you. Anybody else? Any other committee members before I let public comment happen? Okay, Linda Williams, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I was looking at the chart that Peter put up, and the largest response area was Surfside. I found that interesting since we're probably the only area that does not flood. Somewhere along the line, I may have waterfront property, but not right now. And I think what you've got to consider about these various areas in the Civic League, because I never got the survey, because I didn't pay my $10 to become part of the Surfside Association. And you may be running into that on these various areas that did not respond, because if you are not members of that particular association, you don't get the survey. So I'm pretty interested in that Surfside one, because they meet twice a summer. I know Brant Point meets twice a summer. That area you should probably have a traveling show, because a lot of these groups, the Mattocket Conservation, Surfside, Brant Point, they all meet once or twice a summer. And if you want to get this word out, maybe get more responses to the survey, you might want to have a little show at each one of these area association meetings, because your chances are you're going to reach people. But if you want a wider swath, you need to get a hold of all of us that are not members of our particular associations to respond, because whatever happens, it's a community-wide thing, and everybody needs to buy into whatever we're going to do. It may not affect me out here in Surfside, but I'm concerned about what it's going to be affect in town and anywhere in the harbor, as the chairman of the Harbor Plan Work Group, and Peter's on that with me. This is a global issue for the island. And I think we need to reach more people, and you need to get more responses to those surveys. But you got to show up at those association meetings during the summer, or figure out another way of getting to us to answer these things that are not members of our particular association. The area plans for Surfside is the largest one done. The area plan for Mattocket, there's an area plan for Sconset and Tom Nevers. You may be able to reach more people by going through the area plan lists, because that includes every single household. That's just my 2 cents, but I think we need to have more participation.
So thank you, Linda. And we already sort of have the traveling Leah Hill show, and she's been to several area associations already. And I imagine she will continue to do that. And it's a good point that we should find a way to get the survey to people in the summertime who are actually here. You know, us going to the breakfast and saying, here, this is going on, and can you get this survey to your members now that they're here? And can you somehow get it to people who haven't paid the $10 or whatever it is? Because this is how important it is. So I agree with that. Does anybody have any more comments?
Peter, could I just say something, in response to this part of the conversation? You don't need another survey, and you don't need to do surveys. I'm just saying this is what you could wring out of the survey that you got. What I'm proposing is exactly along the lines of the suggestion that we give priority to this at our president's breakfasts, where you all can interface with our presidents and say, this is what we're trying to do. This is how we're trying to do it. And we want to work with you to activate the concern that your members should have to want to have this happen. And that's a far more successful next step than trying to see what you can learn from what people say on volunteer surveys. You know enough now. What I've told you is you know enough now about at least 2 places where people are, fired up and ready to go.
Okay.
So you'd want to talk to those 2 presidents.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you coming in and taking the time to analyze it and sharing your thoughts. Really, really appreciate it. And let us know about when the breakfast is, and then talk to Leah about it, and we'll hopefully find a way to be there.
Okay, will do. Thanks.
Okay, any more comments from the committee? Any more public comment? Excellent. Okay. So, move on to number 7, discussion on next steps for coastal resiliency. Oh, wait. Yeah, okay. So other outlets, we did that. What to do with the results, we talked about that. So discussion on next site visit. I'm hoping that we can keep going on site visits, and does anyone have a suggestion on where should we go next? What's important to us to go see, and hopefully have somebody outside of the committee and outside of the NRD give us a presentation while, like David Gray did for us at the plant. It's okay if you don't have an answer now. I'm just throwing it out there. You want to email me or contact Leah. Okay. Public outreach ideas and strategies from committee members. Do we have an updated scorecard, Doug?
Yes. Hi, Peter. You may or may not be able to see it. I don't know, Lee, if you can share it, that'd be great. Thanks. Yeah, I just updated it quickly. There's just a couple of highlights. Number one, we are now past 230,000 total impressions. We're in a bit of a lull, as I was explaining to Leah. It seems like for the last 8 to 10 weeks, the exposure is really coming through the NRD Facebook and Instagram pages, as well as the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy is a regular sharer of that content. We've seen a couple from Land Bank. Other than that, it seems like the other partners have tailed off a bit. So we need to figure out a way to kind of reinvigorate their interest in sharing this content. As I said last time, I do think there's an awful lot of CRP related content that's being posted independently by these other aligned organizations. So I think this is just showing a sort of a subset of the exposure for CRP awareness. But again, we're in a bit of a lull in terms of seeing direct reposting. That's all I got.
Excellent. Thank you, Doug.
Yep.
Leah, go ahead.
I had a question for Doug. Do you suggest, or what do you suggest to kind of increase those postings and get out of the lull?
Yeah, I had intended several weeks ago, and I have not gotten to it, to send a thank you note to past organizations, the social media coordinators at each of the aligned organizations, just thanking them for their past alignment and cooperation. and just encouraging them to stick with it, maybe sharing a little bit of the success from the fourth quarter and early first quarter. And, just trying to instill a little bit more enthusiasm for it. It is it's a long slog. A campaign takes a long time to unfold. And so I just figured a little bit of positive reinforcement might help. I'm eager for any other ideas that people have.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Jen, you got something?
I do. Thanks, Pete. It's a question, I guess, when stuff goes up, because I'm not on social media that often, but when I see it, I remind, our people to look for it. Are you tagging those other organizations when you're posting so they find it? Because I think, I know they have their kind of media schedule set a month ahead of time. So I think with the tagging, they're reposting, but also it might just fall on a day that they're not getting to that. So I wonder if I like the reach out that you mentioned, Doug. So maybe that other reach out and a reminder, but maybe also a reminder, add it to your schedules for this date. These are the dates, we're always doing it. And maybe even a beginning of the month email reminder that, hey, the stuff is coming. Like, I don't think you should email every single week that stuff goes out, but I was just thinking of like another method of a reminder that posts are coming might make sure that it actually gets onto the organization's posting schedules.
Peter, can I respond?
Yes, we got one more minute to go. So
Yeah, and I imagine Leah may have some other things to add. Thanks, Jen. Yes, I totally agree. We don't want to overdo it. But full disclosure, I haven't followed up with them at all yet this year, so I need to do that. The big hits for us, honestly, have come when folks like the Conservation Foundation have actually gone the extra mile and included bits in their newsletters and things like that. So that's really where we get the kind of added exposure. And I'm sure Leah has some other things to add.
thanks, Doug. Leah, do you have anything to say? No? Okay.
I don't have anything to add. At this
Okay.
time.
We'll move on to new business committee and natural resources department reports from planning board, Concom, Harbor and Shellfish Advisory Board, Select Board, Advisory Committee of Non-Voting Taxpayers, and other committees. Okay. Discussion of upcoming meeting dates. The next meeting is April 23rd, 2024 on Zoom. Okay. If there's nothing else, who wants the motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Matt Fee, motion to adjourn. Take a second.
Yeah.
Who was that?
Second, Jen.
Jen seconded. Okay. All right. So roll call vote. Jen Carberg,
Aye.
Tim Brain,
Aye.
Gary Beller,
Aye.
Sarah Boyce,
Hi.
Doug Rose,
Aye.
Matt Fee.
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Thank you guys. How do you guys how are you liking that we're having less stuff going on in the meetings? Is that a better format for everyone? We're not trying to cram it all in.
Yeah.
I mean, I think even with this meeting, we had 2 items and it seemed like, oh, we're going to run out of space. And so it seems like that's working. We'll just keep doing that.
I appreciated the ability to fully listen to Kirk and let everybody had a chance to ask questions rather than rushing. I really appreciated that.
Good. So you guys all think about a site visit somewhere. Don't leave me hanging. See me in the street, the supermarket, whatever. You had a brainstorm. You don't have to make it formal. Just tell me about it. Okay, go outside.